Well, hello and greetings from Gettysburg. I did want to talk a little bit today, just a brief video to give you a little bit more background into the 18th century labor and why they were the way they were. A big part of this in early American history has to do with what's called the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts were a series of legislation that was passed by Parliament in England to create what's called a closed economic system. This was part of the colonial system where the colonies themselves were to provide the raw materials that were going to be then produced into finished goods in the home country and then sent back to the colonies to be sold. It created a captive market. Now, the Navigation Acts start with Oliver Cromwell after the English Civil War as a means of combating the Dutch by requiring that English goods be transported and sold on English ships with English sailors. This became extraordinarily successful. In fact, it became so successful that after the Restoration, when Charles II comes into power, they keep it. They keep the system in place, and so you have, in effect, you have an entrapment of colonists who are legally bound to purchase only goods that arrive into the colonies via English ships with tax stamps. This was another way that the English could wind up levying taxes on all of the goods that, one, the raw materials coming into England, and two, the goods going out to the colonies. And this began to really get colonists upset. They were not permitted by law to trade with any other nations outside of the goods that were supposed to be coming in and out via those ships. Of course, in the Americas, that didn't always sit so well. When you talk about the concept of free trade, what free trade was in the 17th and 18th century was considered smuggling. Yes, smuggling, a crime. Now, bearing in mind also that if you've read your text, you understand that employers slash masters of their trade were working alongside those that they employed under either an indentured system or an apprentice system. And the status that both of them held was pretty equal. Yes, the employer slash master also did wind up having an elevated status, but for the most part within society they were seen as equals. This closed system of navigation acts wound up creating a concept of solidarity among the colonists themselves, and it also wound up driving individuals within various markets to engage in smuggling, to engage in finding the highest dollar they can get for the products that they are producing. At one point, it was actually a capital offense, meaning you could be executed for being found in possession of a hat that did not have the English tax stamp or broad arrow inside of it, meaning that it was not taxed. This was a capital punishment. And so this began to get people just a little bit irritated. And this closed system really only wound up benefiting England itself. And this took generations really to get to the boiling point. You would think it would be something pretty rapid, but it took a little while. Because we still considered ourselves as Englishmen. We didn't consider ourselves Americans, not really until the First Continental Congress and Lexington and Concord. We we're still considering ourselves as Englishmen. So keep that in the back of your head. And when you're talking about labor, understand the kind of economy that labor was in. This was a closed economic system that was designed to benefit the mother country, not necessarily the hat maker or the cordwainer or the carpenter or the shipbuilder, so forth and so on. And you're going to find each one of these particular labor markets is going to wind up setting up eventually one of their own labor unions later on. And we're going to get to that. Many of them will begin in the early 19th century. If you've reading your text, you found that out. But back to the Navigation Acts, and this is part and parcel of what leads to the American Revolution itself, is the taxes that are being levied and the rampant disregard for the Navigation Acts that are taking place within the American colonies themselves. At one point, you do have the English monarch James II, who sets up the Dominion series. He decides that this is no longer, we're not going to tolerate any of this smuggling anymore, that we're actually going to start really cramping down on it and making sure that the taxes that are being levied get paid. And this led to massive amounts of pushback, because what's been happening is over various generations, people had been simply ignoring the Navigation Acts as much as they can in an effort to retain as much income for the goods that they're selling, whether they're selling them to the Dutch in the Caribbean or the French in the Caribbean, or if they're trading with the natives or up in Canada or somewhere else. They were always trying to get the biggest buck for their product. And this was not necessarily the way that England wanted them to trade. Because if you actually did so legally, you would not make as much as you were by smuggling itself. The pushback that began to take place over the Dominion setup came to a head really in New York. There was actually a revolution against this government before we had our own American Revolution itself. They actually arrested Governor Andros and sent him back across the Atlantic Ocean in chains over actively enforcing this Navigation Act system. Another way we realized that it had been ignored so strongly in Marketplace of Revolution, a really good look at economics in the 18th century world, they found that the amount of molasses that was legally coming into the state of Massachusetts. Now you go, molasses, what's the big deal there? It's like sugary stuff. Well, that's what you make rum out of, okay? And a lot of people like rum. And there was so much rum being produced in Massachusetts that there is no possible way that the amount of legal molasses coming into Massachusetts could wind up producing that much rum. And we're talking in multiples of, at least 10 to 20 times the amount of molasses was being smuggled in than was being legally brought in. It was a huge number. This is a massive amount of discontent. And then you wound up with the Glorious Revolution in England. This was when Cromwell winds up taking over